Life. The single word from Judge Arthur Vance was meant to end 17-year-old David Anderson's world. The judge saw a thug, another black teen to be erased by the system. He didn't see the hero who had been trying to save a man's life. And he had no idea he had just sentenced the son of the most powerful lawyer in America. Led away in cuffs with one phone call, David didn't dial for sympathy. He dialed for justice. That call would unleash a federal firestorm aimed at the judge himself. David was calling his dad, the U.S. Attorney General. The echo of the gavel seemed to hang in the air long after the sound itself had died. For David Anderson, it was more than a sound. It was a physical force that traveled up through the polished floor of the Fulton County Superior Court, into the soles of his ill-fitting dress shoes, and settled deep in his bones. A permanent, resonant chill. Life. The word was a void, an abyss that had just opened at his feet. He felt a strange detachment, as if watching a movie about someone else, some other black kid whose life had just been casually erased under the fluorescent lights of courtroom C12. He chanced to look over his shoulder. His mother, Sarah, was a crumple of navy blue in the second row, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her face, the face that had always been his anchor, was buried in the hands of his aunt. Beside them, his friends from school, the ones who had dared to show up, looked pale and lost. They were kids. They were supposed to be thinking about college applications and prom dates, not watching one of their own being swallowed whole by the system. David's public defender, a tired, well-meaning man named Mr. Evans, placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch felt distant, disconnected. "We'll appeal, David," he whispered, his voice hoarse with the defeat he'd clearly been anticipating. "This isn't over, but it felt over. It had felt over from the moment he was arrested. It had all started 6 months ago, at a protest in downtown Atlanta. It was a peaceful march for climate justice, the kind of thing David and his friends were passionate about. He'd made signs in his garage, poring over statistics about carbon emissions, his hands stained with green and blue paint. He was a quiet kid, a self-described science nerd who ran cross-country and spent his weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. His biggest act of rebellion before this had been convincing his parents to install solar panels on their modest suburban home. The protest had been loud but positive, a sea of young, hopeful faces chanting for a better future. Then, from the periphery, a different element bled into the crowd. Agitators, their faces covered, began smashing storefront windows. Chaos erupted. The police responded with tear gas and riot shields. In the ensuing panic, David got separated from his friends. He remembered the sting of the gas, the screams, the terrifying surge of the crowd. He'd seen an older man, a shop owner, fall to the ground, struck by a brick thrown by one of the vandals. David, guided by an instinct he didn't know he possessed, had pushed through the stampede to help him. He was trying to check the man's pulse when the police descended, their batons raised. All they saw was a black teenager in a hoodie kneeling over a white man's body. The man later died from a brain hemorrhage. The brick thrower was never found. But the prosecution, led by an ambitious assistant district attorney with an eye on the upcoming election, had found their villain. They built a narrative around David. They painted him as a violent thug, a wolf in sheep's clothing who used the protest as cover for his true, destructive nature. They presented grainy surveillance footage that showed him near the scene, conveniently ignoring the clearer cell phone video from a bystander that showed him trying to render aid. Video Mr. Evans had fought to get admitted, only to have it dismissed by Judge Vance as inconclusive and potentially prejudicial. Judge Arthur Vance. From the moment the trial began, David felt the weight of the judge's gaze. It wasn't a look of impartial assessment. It was a look of confirmation. As if everything he already believed about a kid like David, young, black, angry, was being proven right before his eyes. Vance had built a career on being tough on crime, a reputation that played well in the northern suburbs of Fulton County. He interrupted Mr. Evans constantly, sustained every objection from the prosecution, and instructed the jury with language that seemed to presume guilt. The all-white jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours. Now, 2 court officers were moving toward him. One unlocked the cuffs from the bar on the defense table. The other grabbed his arm with a grip that was unnecessarily tight. The world narrowed to a series of disjointed images: the wood grain on the courtroom door, the scuff marks on the floor, the impassive face of the court reporter as she packed up her equipment. He didn't look at his mother again. He couldn't bear it. He was led through a side door and into a sterile hallway. The muffled sounds of the courtroom faded, replaced by the jangle of keys and the static of a guard's radio. The air grew colder. Every step took him further from his life, from the person he was, the boy who loved astronomy and dreamed of studying at Georgia Tech, and closer to the label that had just been branded on him: murderer, inmate, a life sentence. They pushed him into a concrete holding cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a deafening clang, the sound of a period at the end of a sentence, a final, unappealable declaration. The cell was small, no bigger than a closet, with a single metal bench, and the faint, sour smell of sweat and disinfectant. For the first time since the verdict was read, David allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of it all. His legs gave out, and he slid down the wall onto the cold bench. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to hold the pieces of his shattered reality together. Tears, hot and silent, finally traced paths through the dust and grime on his cheeks. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a killer. He was David. A son. A friend. A kid who had tried to help. But none of that mattered anymore. The system had told its story, and Judge Vance had signed his name to it. The truth had been suffocated under the weight of a convenient lie. He was trapped. A wave of utter hopelessness washed over him, so profound and absolute that it felt like drowning. He had one phone call before they shipped him off to the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, the infamous facility in Jackson, where they sent men sentenced to life. His fingers, clumsy and trembling, reached for the steel payphone on the wall. "Who do you call when your life is over? Mr. Evans?" What could he say? His mother? The sound of her voice would break him completely. He thought of his father. Dad. Always calm, always measured. The man who taught him how to think critically, to look at a problem from every angle before acting. The man who was always traveling for work, whose job was so important and vaguely defined that David had long ago stopped trying to explain it to his friends. He just said he worked for the government. He needed to hear his voice. Not for comfort, not for sympathy. He needed it for the same reason a man lost in the dark needs to see a single, distant star. For direction. For the faintest glimmer of a possibility that this wasn't the end. He took a shaky breath, punched in the memorized number, and pressed the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar, steady voice answered. "This is Robert Anderson." The sterile quiet of the holding cell was broken only by the low hum of the overhead light and the frantic, shallow rhythm of David's own breathing. The phone felt cold and heavy against his ear, a lifeline to a world that had just violently expelled him. Hearing his father's voice, so calm, so professional, was like a splash of icy water. For a moment, David couldn't speak. Words were useless, flimsy things against the concrete and steel reality of his situation. "Dad," he finally managed, his voice cracking, the single word a raw plea. On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Not of confusion, but of a mind instantly shifting gears. Robert Anderson could discern a universe of meaning in a single word from his son. This wasn't the casual, after-school dad. This was something else entirely. "David, where are you? I've been getting calls from your mother. She's not making any sense. Something about a verdict." The professional calm in his father's voice was now overlaid with a thin, tightly controlled layer of urgency. "They found me guilty, Dad." David squeezed his eyes shut. The image of Judge Vance's smug face seared onto the back of his eyelids. "Felony murder. The judge, he just sentenced me." Another pause. Longer this time. David could almost hear the whirring of the gears in his father's brain, processing the impossible. He imagined him in his office, a place David had only seen a handful of times, a cavern of dark wood, leather-bound books, and American flags. A place of immense, quiet power. "Sentenced you to what, son?" Robert's voice was lower now, stripped of all emotion, honed to a razor's edge. It was the voice he used when the stakes were absolute. "Life," David choked out the word, the sound of it raw and ugly in the small cell. "He gave me life in prison." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. For the first time in David's memory, his father sounded speechless. The silence stretched, filled only by the static on the line. David pictured his dad, a tall, imposing man standing from his desk, perhaps turning to look out his window at the distant, indifferent monuments of Washington, D.C. A man who had dedicated his entire career to the concept of American justice, a concept that had just devoured his only child. "David, listen to me," Robert said finally, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "Listen to me very carefully. Where are you right now?" "Exactly. A holding cell. At the courthouse. The Fulton County Superior Court." "Who is with you?" "No one. I'm alone." "Is your lawyer, Mr. Evans, still there?" "I don't know. I think so." "Dad, they're going to transfer me. To Jackson. I heard the guards talking." The panic that had been a low simmer was beginning to boil over. The reality of it, the bus, the processing, the cell block, was closing in. "They are not going to transfer you anywhere," Robert stated. It wasn't a hope or a plea. It was a command, as if he could bend reality through sheer force of will. "I want you to sit tight. Do not talk to anyone. Do not sign anything. Do you understand me, David?" "Yes, but what?" "Don't ask questions right now, son. Just breathe. I need you to hold yourself together. I'm handling it. I'm going to make some calls." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a man who moved pieces on a board far bigger than David could comprehend. There was a brief moment of static, the sound of a hand shifting on the receiver. "David," his father said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, a crack in the granite facade. "I know you're scared, but you are not alone in this. I promise you." And then the line went dead. David stood there for a long moment, the silent receiver still pressed to his ear. A strange sense of calm began to settle over him, pushing back the edges of his despair. He didn't know what his father could do. He couldn't imagine what calls he could possibly make that would matter. His dad was a lawyer, yes, a very important one. But this was a state conviction, a life sentence. It was a done deal, a sealed and delivered nightmare. He hung up the phone and slid back down onto the bench. He thought about his father's promise. "You are not alone in this." For the past 6 months, he had felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Alone in his cell at the county jail, alone at the defense table, alone in the face of the state's monolithic power. But now, a tiny, defiant spark of something. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, ignited in his chest. Minutes later, he heard the heavy tread of footsteps approaching his cell. The slot in the door slid open, and a guard's face appeared, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Anderson," the guard grunted, "your transfer is on hold. Sit tight." The slot slammed shut. David stared at the steel door. On hold? Why? His heart began to beat a little faster. Something was happening. The unshakable certainty of his fate had, for the first time, developed a hairline fracture. Meanwhile, 3 states away, in the heart of the nation's capital, Robert Anderson stood behind the formidable oak desk of his office. He had just hung up the phone with his son, but his hand still rested on the receiver, his knuckles white. The view from his window showed the Capitol building, its dome gleaming in the afternoon sun, a symbol of the ideals he had sworn to uphold. Ideals that had just been grotesquely twisted into a weapon against his own child. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Cynthia," he said, his voice dangerously level, "cancel my 4 o'clock with the senator. Get me Kristen Bell on the line, now." His chief of staff's voice crackled back, flustered. "Mr. Attorney General, the senator is already on his way here." Robert Anderson took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked at the nameplate on his desk, the one that had been the culmination of a lifetime of work, of sacrifice, of unyielding belief in the rule of law. It read, "Robert L. Anderson, Attorney General of the United States. Tell the senator," he said, his voice as cold and hard as marble, "that there is a fire, and I'm on my way to put it out. The office of the Attorney General of the United States is a sanctuary of power. It is a room designed to project stability and authority, with walls paneled in dark wood, floors buffered by a thick Persian rug, and the weight of history palpable in the air. Portraits of Robert's predecessors stared down from the walls, their gazes a silent testament to the burden of the office. For Robert Anderson, this room had always been a fortress, the command center from which he waged war on corruption, injustice, and threats to the nation. Today, it felt like a cage. The call with David had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had fundamentally rewired his universe. The Attorney General, the man tasked with upholding the nation's laws, was gone. In his place was a father, primal and singular in his purpose, a cold, silent rage, the likes of which he had not felt in years, settled over him. It wasn't the hot, reckless anger of youth, but something far more dangerous, a focused, calculated fury, forged in the crucible of power and intellect. Kristen Bell, the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, was on the line in under a minute. She was a brilliant, tenacious lawyer, whom Robert had personally recruited from the Southern Poverty Law Center. She was, in his estimation, one of the few people in Washington who still genuinely believed in the work. "Kristen," Robert began, dispensing with pleasantries, "I have a situation. It's personal, but its implications are broad." "Sir?" Kristen's voice was sharp with attention. She knew his tone. This wasn't a policy discussion. "My son, David, was just sentenced in a state court in Georgia, Fulton County Superior Court, life in prison on a felony murder charge." He delivered the information with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, though each word was a shard of glass in his own throat. There was a stunned silence on the other end. Kristen knew he had a son, but Robert was a fiercely private man. "My God, Robert," she finally breathed. I had no idea. What happened?" "What happened," Robert said, his voice tightening, "is a catastrophic failure of the justice system. The case involves a protest that turned violent. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, and exculpatory evidence was suppressed by the judge. The jury was not his peers. The sentence is a travesty." He paced behind his desk, the movement tight, coiled. "This is not just a father speaking, Kristen. I've reviewed the case files Mr. Evans has been sending me for months. I stayed out of it, trusting the process. That trust was a mistake." He stopped at the window, looking out over the city. A black teenager, a peaceful protester, tried to help a man who was injured and was railroaded by a prosecutor looking for a headline and a judge looking to burnish his tough-on-crime credentials. It's a story that's happened 1,000 times in this country. This time it happened to my son. "What do you need, Robert?" Kristen asked, her voice already shifting from shock to action. "I need the full weight of the Civil Rights Division. I want a pattern or practice investigation opened into the Fulton County DA's office and the Atlanta Police Department, effective immediately. But the priority is the judge, Arthur Vance. I want to know everything about him. Every case he's ever presided over, every sentence he's ever handed down. I want to see the racial disparities in his sentencing. I want his financial records, his political affiliations, his club memberships. I want to know who he is, and I want to find every instance where his bias has compromised his oath. We'll need a predicate, a formal complaint to launch a full investigation of this scale," Kristen advised, the lawyer in her outlining the necessary steps. "We have one," Robert countered. "A complaint was filed 6 weeks ago by the local NAACP chapter regarding sentencing disparities in his courtroom. It was flagged for preliminary review. This is no longer a preliminary review. This is the main event. And we have a new, urgent data point: the unconstitutional sentencing of a minor to life in prison without parole based on flimsy evidence and a compromised judicial process," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I also need a team on the ground in Atlanta, by morning, top people. I want them to start with the case file of the state of Georgia versus David Anderson. I want them to re-interview every witness. I want them to find the evidence that was buried. I want them to find the person who actually threw that brick, and I want you to file an emergency motion in the Northern District of Georgia. I want a federal court to issue a stay on my son's transfer to state prison pending a federal civil rights review. Cite cruel and unusual punishment and a violation of his 14th Amendment rights to due process. Consider it done," Kristen said, a new steeliness in her own voice. She understood the unspoken part of the command. This wasn't just about justice for one boy. It was about using the immense power of their office to expose a rot. David's case would be the battering ram. "One more thing, Kristen," Robert said, turning from the window. "I am formally recusing myself from this investigation. You will have full operational command. You will report to the Deputy Attorney General. My involvement, officially, ends with this phone call. Understood?" "Understood, Robert." She knew the recusal was a legal necessity. He couldn't be seen as using his office to settle a personal score. But they both knew the truth. His shadow would loom over every part of this. The full force of the Department of Justice was being mobilized because of a single phone call from a holding cell. After he hung up with Kristen, Robert called his chief of staff back. "Cynthia, get me a flight to Atlanta tonight. Commercial, no fanfare." "Sir, what should I tell your security detail?" "Tell them I am visiting family on a personal matter, which is the truth." He hung up and stood in the center of the silent, cavernous office. The weight of his badge, of his title, felt heavier than ever before. For years, he had wielded it as a shield for the American people, a weapon against the unjust. He had always maintained a professional distance, a belief that the law was a dispassionate instrument that must be kept separate from personal feeling. He saw now what a luxury that belief had been. The law wasn't an abstract concept. It was a wrench, a hammer, a scalpel. It was a tool that, in the wrong hands, could build a cage. Judge Vance and the Fulton County DA had used the law to build a cage for his son, and he, Robert Anderson, would use that same law to tear it down, brick by brick. And then he would tear down the men who built it. Judge Arthur Vance unbuttoned his black robe and let it slide from his shoulders, hanging it carefully on the ornate mahogany coat rack in the corner of his chambers. He felt a familiar sense of satisfaction, the kind a craftsman feels after a job well done. He had taken a threat off the streets. He had upheld the law. He had sent a message. That's what today was about, a message. These kids with their protests and their slogans thought they could disrupt the peace, thought there were no consequences. They were wrong. His chambers were a reflection of his self-image, orderly, traditional, and imposing. The walls were lined with leather-bound law books that were rarely opened, and the furniture was dark, heavy, and expensive. A framed photo on his desk showed him shaking hands with the governor. Another showed him with his wife on their yacht, the Veritas. Truth. It was a principle he believed he embodied. "A strong sentence, Judge," his clerk, a young, eager-to-please man named Ben, said from the doorway. Ben was sorting through the afternoon's filings, his face still flushed with the drama of the courtroom. "It was a necessary sentence, Ben," Vance corrected, pouring himself a glass of water from a crystal carafe. "Felony murder is not a child's game. You participate in a riot, a man dies, you pay the price. The law is clear on that." "The defense will appeal, of course," Ben noted. Vance gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let them. The appellate court knows my record. I run a tight ship. The conviction is sound. Life in prison. That should give young Mr. Anderson ample time to reflect on his poor choices." He took a sip of water, savoring the cool liquid. He truly believed he had done the boy a favor, in a way. He had given his life a structure, a purpose, however grim. He sat down at his large, immaculate desk and began signing orders from previous cases. The Anderson case was already receding in his mind, just another file to be closed, another conviction to add to his legacy. He saw himself as a bulwark against the rising tide of chaos he read about online and saw on the news, the moral decay, the lack of respect for authority. He wasn't just a judge. He was a guardian of civilization. An hour later, Ben knocked and entered again, a slight frown on his face. "Judge, I just got a call from the clerk's office. It's odd." "What is it?" Vance asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "We've received an inquiry from the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division." Now Vance looked up, his pen hovering over a signature line. "The DOJ? What about?" "They're requesting the complete record for State vs. Anderson. Transcripts, evidence logs, jury selection notes, all of it. They cited a preliminary review in response to a civil rights complaint filed by the NAACP a few weeks back." Vance leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "The NAACP, of course. Crying racism every time a black kid gets what's coming to him. It's a standard tactic. Fishing expedition. Send them what they want, Ben. We have nothing to hide. Let the paper pushers in Washington have their fun. They'll get bored and move on to the next outrage soon enough." "Yes, sir," Ben said, though he still looked uneasy. "It's just, the request was marked as extremely urgent, and they also requested a list of all felony convictions in your courtroom for the past 10 years, broken down by race and sentencing length." The judge's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. That was unusual. A statistical deep dive was more than a fishing expedition. It was the precursor to something more serious. Still, he projected an air of untroubled confidence. "Let them have it," he said with a sigh, feigning boredom. "It's a waste of taxpayer money, but it's their prerogative. My record is unimpeachable. The numbers will show I am tough, but fair." He conveniently ignored the fact that his definition of fair often resulted in sentences for minority defendants that were, on average, 20% longer than for their white counterparts for similar crimes, a statistic he had once boasted about at a private fundraiser. But as the afternoon wore on, a small seed of unease began to sprout in the judge's manicured garden of self-assurance. Another call came, this one from the DA's office. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ramsey, the prosecutor in the Anderson case, was on the line, and he sounded panicked. "Arthur, what the hell is going on?" Ramsey's voice was a high-pitched whine. "I've got 2 DOJ lawyers sitting in my conference room. They look like they just stepped out of an FBI recruiting poster. They're asking about witness prep in the Anderson case. They're asking about the cell phone video we got from that bystander. The video was inconclusive, Mark. We established that," Vance said, his own voice now tighter than he would have liked. "Well, they don't seem to think so. They're asking why it wasn't shown to the jury. They're talking about Brady violations, Arthur." A Brady violation, the suppression of exculpatory evidence by the prosecution, was a serious allegation. It could get a conviction overturned. It could get a prosecutor disbarred. And it could make the presiding judge look, at best, incompetent, and at worst, complicit. "Calm down, Mark," Vance snapped, his patience wearing thin. "You did nothing wrong. You presented your case. The jury was convinced. That's all that matters. These DC types are just trying to rattle us." He hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the photograph of the governor, but it offered no comfort now. The walls of his chamber, once a symbol of his power and security, suddenly felt a little closer, a little more constricting. This was more than a routine inquiry. It was coordinated. It was aggressive. Someone had kicked a hornet's nest. His mind raced. The Anderson boy. He'd seemed like a nobody, just another kid from the south side of town, caught up in something he couldn't handle. His mother was a teacher, his father. The file said he was a lawyer, some corporate attorney in D.C., he'd assumed. He hadn't even bothered to show up for the trial. Some father. The judge's unease slowly curdled into anger. This was an affront to his authority, to the sovereignty of his courtroom and his state. Who did these people think they were? He had been elected by the people of Fulton County to pass judgment, and that's what he had done. He was the law here. His thoughts were interrupted by Ben, who appeared at his door one last time, looking as pale as a ghost. "Judge," he stammered, holding a piece of paper. "This just came through from the U.S. District Court. It's an emergency stay. A federal judge has ordered that David Anderson's transfer to state custody be halted, pending a federal review of his civil rights. It's effective immediately." Judge Vance stood up so abruptly that his chair screeched back against the hardwood floor. He snatched the paper from Ben's hand. He read the crisp, legalistic text, his face turning a dark, mottled red. A federal judge had just countermanded his order. His sentence. It was a direct, stunning rebuke of his authority. "On what grounds?" he roared, the paper shaking in his fist. Ben swallowed hard. "The motion was filed by the Department of Justice, sir. It cites potential, and I'm quoting, a shocking miscarriage of justice orchestrated by a biased and compromised court." The arrival of the Department of Justice in Atlanta was not a loud, dramatic affair. There were no flashing lights or press conferences. It was something far more unnerving, a quiet, methodical infiltration. The team Kristen Bell had assembled was lean, elite, and moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew they held all the cards. They set up a temporary command center in a block of rooms at the Four Seasons, a neutral ground far from the prying eyes of the Fulton County Courthouse. The two lead investigators, Sarah Chen and Marcus Hayes, were veterans of the Civil Rights Division. Chen was a data savant, a woman who could find the ghost of injustice in the machine of statistics. Hayes was an old-school investigator, a former homicide detective from Baltimore with an unerring instinct for when people were lying. They were the tip of the spear, and their first target was the paper trail of State v. Anderson. They didn't just request the file, they requisitioned it, arriving at the courthouse with a federal order that left no room for debate. The county clerk, a woman who had worked there for 30 years and viewed every file as her personal property, sputtered in protest but ultimately complied, watching with hostile eyes as they boxed up every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper associated with David's case. Back at the hotel, they laid it all out. It was a masterclass in building a weak case. The prosecution's timeline was full of holes. The testimony of their key witness, a local man with 2 prior convictions for perjury, read like a script fed to him by the DA's office. But the most damning piece of evidence was what was missing. "Here it is," Chen said, pointing to a line item in the evidence log. Exhibit 27B, bystander cell phone video, 38 seconds. It's logged as received from the APD, but it's not in the evidence box, and the discovery manifest shows it was never turned over to the defense. Evans, the public defender, said he filed a motion to compel, But Vance denied it, claiming the prosecution had already shared all relevant evidence, Hayes recalled, flipping through his notes. Ramsey, the ADA, told the court the video was blurry and irrelevant. He lied. And Vance let him. The lie was the crack they needed. While Chen began the monumental task of cross-referencing 10 years of Judge Vance's sentencing data, Hayes went to work on the human element. He didn't start with the cops or the DA. He started at the edges. His first visit was to the bystander who shot the video, a college student named Maria Flores. She was terrified, convinced that talking would somehow get her in trouble. Hayes met her at a coffee shop near the Georgia State campus. He didn't intimidate or pressure. He just listened. "I gave the video to the police," she told him, her voice barely a whisper. "I told them, you can see the boy in the hoodie was trying to help. The man who threw the brick, he ran the other way. The police officer told me they'd take care of it." "Did you ever hear from the district attorney's office?" Hayes asked gently. She shook her head. "No. I called them, twice, to ask if they needed me to testify. They never called me back. Then I saw on the news that the boy had been charged, and I got scared. I felt like they didn't want to hear what I saw." Hayes got a copy of the video file directly from her. It was crystal clear. It showed David pushing through the crowd, kneeling, and attempting to stop the bleeding from the shop owner's head wound with his own sweatshirt. It showed him looking around frantically, shouting for help. It was the footage of a hero, not a murderer. Next, Hayes paid a visit to the prosecution's star witness, a man named Jimmy Doyle. He found him at a dilapidated boarding house, smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. The perjury convictions were leverage, but Hayes didn't need them. Doyle's conscience, flimsy as it was already eating at him. "Ramsey's office told me what to say," Doyle slurred, staring into a glass of tap water as if it held all the answers. "They said the Anderson kid was a gangbanger, that he gave me a dirty look right before the brick was thrown. It was a lie. I was 50 feet away. I didn't see who threw it." "So why did you testify, Jimmy?" Hayes asked, his voice even. Doyle looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a pathetic mixture of fear and resentment. "They had a possession charge hanging over my head. My third strike. Ramsey said he'd make it go away if I helped them put the right person behind bars. He said the city needed a win, that people were scared. A coerced witness, a buried piece of exculpatory evidence. It was more than enough to vacate the conviction. But they weren't just there to free David Anderson. They were there to clean house. The investigation radiated outward. Other members of the DOJ team began quietly re-interviewing the Atlanta PD officers who were at the scene. They found inconsistencies in their reports, signs of a narrative being shaped after the fact to fit the chosen suspect. They subpoenaed emails and text messages between the DA's office and the police department, messages that revealed a coordinated effort to pin the crime on David from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen's work was yielding its own poisonous fruit. Judge Vance's sentencing record was a statistical horror show. When plotted on a graph, the disparity was undeniable. For identical crimes, with defendants who had similar criminal histories, Vance sentenced black defendants to an average of 3.4 years longer than white defendants. For juvenile offenders, the gap was even wider. David's sentence wasn't an anomaly. It was the brutal culmination of a decade-long pattern. The pressure began to build. Whispers started to circulate through the courthouse and police headquarters. The quiet confidence of the local authorities began to fray, replaced by a nervous, defensive posture. Phone calls were made. Political allies were consulted. But the DOJ's investigation was a sealed black box. No one knew how much they knew. By the end of the week, the team had what they needed. It was a damning, airtight case, not just against the conviction of David Anderson, but against the very apparatus of justice in Fulton County. They had found evidence of witness tampering, evidence suppression, police misconduct, and a clear, demonstrable pattern of judicial bias. On Friday evening, Kristen Bell flew into Atlanta and met with her team in the hotel suite. They laid out the entire case for her. She listened intently, her expression grim. "This is worse than we thought," she said when they had finished. "This isn't just one bad judge. This is systemic. It's rotten to the core." She turned to Hayes. "Have you found the real killer?" "We're close," Hayes said. "Facial recognition got a partial match on the brick thrower from Maria's video, an agitator with known ties to a white nationalist group. The APD had his file. They just never bothered to look." Kristen nodded slowly. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "We're ready," she said into the receiver. "It's time to take the next step." The call was to the office of the Deputy Attorney General, but the message was for the man who was waiting, the man who had set this all in motion. The unraveling was complete. The storm was about to break. The storm broke not as a thunderclap, but as a leak. A single, well-placed story on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, citing an unnamed source within the Department of Justice. Dordro. DOJ probes Fulton County Judge, Day's Office in Civil Rights Investigation. Juvenile's life sentence at center of inquiry. The article was a bombshell. It detailed, in precise and damning language, the federal investigation into Judge Arthur Vance and the Office of District Attorney Mark Ramsey. It mentioned a pattern of racial bias in sentencing, the suppression of key evidence, and the coerced testimony of a witness in the case of a recently convicted teenager, David Anderson. The story didn't name the Attorney General's son. It didn't have to. It was explosive enough on its own. Within hours, the local story went national. It was picked up by the wire services, then cable news. The quiet investigation was now a blazing public scandal. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and now the swarm was descending on Judge Vance. For Vance, the article was a declaration of war. He read it in his chambers, the newsprint trembling in his hands. His initial reaction was blustering rage. He called Ben into his office and dictated a furious statement to the press, calling the investigation a politically motivated witch hunt and a gross overreach of federal authority. He declared his record spotless and vowed to fight the allegations with every fiber of his being. But behind the bravado, panic was taking root. His phone began to ring incessantly. The first call was from the chief judge of the Superior Court, his voice a cold, clipped demand for an explanation. The second was from the governor's office, the aide's tone a perfect blend of feigned support and palpable distance. His political allies, the ones who had praised his law and order stance at fundraisers, were suddenly unavailable. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters, who had held small vigils for David Anderson after his sentencing, now gathered on the courthouse steps by the hundreds. This time their signs bore a new name, Judge Vance. "Impeach Vance," one read. "Justice for David, jail for the judge," said another. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined the street, their cameras aimed at the windows of his chambers like cannons. The judge, who had always seen himself as a pillar of the community, was now its pariah. He started taking the back entrance to the courthouse, scuttling through hallways where clerks and lawyers would suddenly find something interesting to look at on the floor as he passed. The deference and respect he had taken for granted his entire career evaporated overnight, replaced by whispers and hostile glares. His carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. At home, his wife, who had always stood by him, now looked at him with a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Arthur, is there any truth to this?" she asked over a tense, silent dinner. Her question was a betrayal he couldn't stomach. He retreated further into a fortress of self-righteousness and paranoia. He saw the DOJ's hand everywhere. He became convinced his phone was tapped, his chambers bugged. He snapped at Ben for the smallest perceived slight. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that settled on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He started having trouble sleeping, his nights filled with anxious dreams of gavels cracking and faceless protesters shouting his name. The pressure was just as intense at the district attorney's office. Mark Ramsey, the ambitious prosecutor, found himself in an impossible position. His boss, the DA, publicly supported him, but privately told him to handle it. The DOJ's presence was a constant, unnerving reality. Federal investigators had become a fixture in the building, interviewing his staff, poring over old case files, and creating an atmosphere of deep-seated mistrust. His colleagues started treating him like a leper. The win that was supposed to propel his career had become a millstone around his neck. He, too, tried to project confidence. He went on a local news channel and defended the conviction, calling David Anderson a violent criminal and the DOJ's investigation an attack on local law enforcement. But his eyes were shifty, his brow slick with sweat. He looked less like a confident prosecutor and more like a cornered animal. The narrative was slipping from their control. The story was no longer about a teenage thug. It was about a corrupt judge and a malicious prosecutor. It was about a system that had failed. The cell phone video, leaked by another unnamed source, went viral. Millions of people now saw with their own eyes what the jury had been prevented from seeing. David Anderson, trying to save a man's life. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. For David, locked away in solitary confinement at the county jail for his own protection, the news came in fragments. He saw a segment on the TV in the common area before a guard quickly changed the channel. He heard the whispers of the other inmates. He didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but he knew its source: his father. This was the call he had promised to make. It wasn't a single call. It was an earthquake. He felt a profound sense of vindication, but it was mixed with a deep, weary sadness. All of this, the media circus, the political firestorm, the ruined careers, just to get to the truth. A truth he had told from the very beginning. The final blow to Judge Vance's crumbling facade came a week after the story broke. He was presiding over a routine arraignment when his clerk, Ben, approached the bench, his face ashen. He handed the judge a folded note. Vance read it, and the blood drained from his face. He looked out at the courtroom, the lawyers, the defendants, the spectators, and for the first time, he didn't see subjects of his authority. He saw a jury. He banged his gavel, the sound weak and uncertain. "This court is in recess," he croaked, and fled from the bench without another word. The note was from the State Commission on Judicial Qualifications. It was a formal notice. Impeachment proceedings had begun. The storm had made landfall. The hearing was not held in the ornate, oppressive courtroom where David had been sentenced. Instead, it took place in the clean, modern, and distinctly federal environment of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, just a few blocks away, but a world apart in terms of power and authority. There was no state flag, only the stars and stripes. The air was different, less theatrical, more precise. This was a place of consequence. David was led into the courtroom by federal marshals, not county deputies. He wore a new suit, one that fit him properly, provided by his father's legal team. He felt a nervous tremor in his hands, but for the first time in months, it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. He took his seat at the defense table next to Mr. Evans, who looked 10 years younger, his face alight with a renewed sense of purpose. The gallery was packed. Reporters, legal scholars, and activists filled every bench. David saw his mother in the front row, her face etched with a fragile, prayerful hope. And then he saw him. Seated quietly at the end of her row was his father. Robert Anderson wasn't there in any official capacity. He wore a simple dark suit, no flag pin on his lapel. He was just a man, a father, his gaze fixed on his son with an intensity that seemed to create a silent, unbreakable line of communication between them. He gave David a single, almost imperceptible nod. I am here. Stay strong." At the prosecution's table, there was no sign of Mark Ramsey. In his place sat a senior attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office, along with Kristen Bell from the Civil Rights Division. Their presence was a clear signal. The state of Georgia was no longer running this show. The federal judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Wright, entered, and the room rose. She wasted no time. "This hearing is to review the motion filed by the United States Department of Justice to vacate the conviction of Mr. David Anderson. Ms. Bell, you may begin." Kristen Bell rose, her movements crisp and confident. "Thank you, Your Honor. The government does not bring this motion lightly. The conviction and subsequent sentencing of a minor to life in prison is, in this case, not merely a miscarriage of justice. It is the result of a deliberate and systemic campaign of misconduct, bias, and corruption on the part of the Fulton County District Attorney's Office and the presiding judge, Arthur Vance. Over the next hour, she and her team laid out their findings with devastating surgical precision. They presented the suppressed cell phone video, playing it on large screens for the entire courtroom to see. The footage of David's desperate attempts to help the victim hung in the air, an undeniable testament to his innocence. They put Maria Flores on the stand. She recounted, in a clear, steady voice, how she had tried to give her evidence to the police and the DA, only to be ignored. They presented the sworn affidavit from the prosecution's star witness, Jimmy Doyle, recanting his entire testimony and detailing how Ada Mark Ramsey had coerced him with threats of a third-strike life sentence. They presented emails and text messages showing collusion between Ramsey and the lead detective on the case, demonstrating a clear intent to frame David before any real investigation had taken place. Finally, they presented Sarah Chen's statistical analysis of Judge Vance's sentencing record. The charts and graphs displayed on the screen were stark and damning, showing a clear pattern of racial bias that stretched back over a decade. "The life sentence handed down to David Anderson was not an isolated act, Your Honor," Kristen concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. "It was the predictable and tragic culmination of a broken system, presided over by a judge who has repeatedly demonstrated that he is either unwilling or unable to administer justice fairly and impartially. To allow this conviction to stand would be an insult to the Constitution this court is sworn to uphold." She sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a complete and total demolition. Judge Wright looked over at the local prosecutors from the Fulton County DA's office, who were technically there to defend the original conviction. "Do you have any response?" she asked, her tone making it clear she expected none. The senior prosecutor stood, looking defeated. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, the state of Georgia will not oppose the motion to vacate." A collective gasp went through the gallery. It was over. Judge Wright looked down at David. Her expression, which had been stern and unreadable throughout the proceedings, softened with a hint of compassion. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice clear and firm, "this court finds that your conviction was secured through a gross violation of your constitutional rights. The evidence presented here today is shocking and profoundly disturbing. Therefore, this court grants the motion. Your conviction and sentence are hereby vacated. You are a free man." A sob broke from his mother. The gallery erupted in applause and cheers. Mr. Evans gripped David's shoulder, tears in his own eyes. David just sat there for a second, the words washing over him. A free man. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first truly free breath he had taken in 6 months. He stood up on shaky legs and turned to look at his father. Robert Anderson's stoic composure had finally broken. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Outside the courthouse, a storm of media awaited. David, flanked by his parents and Mr. Evans, stepped up to the microphones. The chaos of shouted questions and flashing cameras was overwhelming, but David felt a strange, new calm settle over him. He had lost his voice in this process, had it stolen from him. Now he was taking it back. He leaned into the microphone, and the crowd fell silent. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady and clear, I was arrested for trying to help someone. I told the truth, but no one wanted to listen. I was told I was a monster. A judge sentenced me to die in prison. Today the truth finally came out. He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't a boy anymore. The last 6 months had aged him, hardened him, but they hadn't broken him. This was never just about me, he said. This happened because the system that is supposed to protect us is broken, because there are people in power who see kids who look like me and decide our guilt before they've even heard our names. I was lucky. I had a family who could fight for me. But how many others aren't so lucky? How many others are in a cell right now because no one would listen? He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. My name is David Anderson, and I am not a monster. I am a survivor of the Fulton County justice system, and I promise you this fight is not over. The ripples from the stone dropped in Judge Wright's courtroom spread fast and wide, turning into a tidal wave that crashed over the landscape of Georgia's legal and political world. David Anderson's calm, powerful words outside the courthouse became the defining soundbite of the scandal, played on a loop on national news. He was no longer just a victim. He was a symbol of a broken system and a catalyst for change. The consequences for the architects of his ordeal were swift and brutal. Judge Arthur Vance's career ended not with a dignified retirement, but with a humiliating public implosion. The impeachment proceedings, bolstered by the irrefutable evidence from the DOJ's investigation, moved at lightning speed. Rather than face the inevitable, Vance resigned in disgrace. But his troubles were far from over. The State Bar of Georgia, citing his clear judicial misconduct and racial bias, permanently disbarred him. Stripped of his robe, his title, and his honor, he became a recluse, a pariah in the very community where he had once been a figure of immense power. The Veritas was quietly put up for sale. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ramsey was fired. The DA's office, in a desperate attempt at damage control, threw him to the wolves. But it wasn't enough. Ramsey faced his own disbarment hearings and, worse, a federal criminal investigation for witness tampering and suborning perjury. His promising career was left in smoldering ruins. The entire Fulton County DA's office was placed under a federal consent decree, a sweeping oversight program managed by the Department of Justice, forcing systemic reforms in how they handled evidence, trained prosecutors, and tracked racial disparities in their cases. The Atlanta Police Department faced its own reckoning. The officers who arrested David and ignored Maria Flores's evidence were suspended, pending an internal affairs and federal investigation into obstruction of justice. The department was forced to overhaul its policies on handling evidence from civilian bystanders and its protocols for riot control. The man who actually threw the brick, a white nationalist agitator named Kyle Schaffer, was arrested a week later. The DOJ, using the facial recognition data the APD had ignored, tracked him to a compound in North Carolina. He was extradited back to Georgia to face murder charges. His arrest was a final, damning indictment of the original investigation's willful blindness. But the most significant changes were legislative. Inspired by the national outrage, a bipartisan group of Georgia state legislators, working with civil rights organizations, drafted a new bill. It was called David's Law. The law mandated an automatic, independent review of any life sentence given to a juvenile. It also established stricter rules for the handling of exculpatory evidence and imposed severe penalties for prosecutors found to be in violation. Weeks after his release, David stood in the gallery of the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta, watching as the bill was signed into law. He had been invited to speak, but he had declined. He didn't want to be a permanent fixture, a professional victim. He wanted his life back. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to study the stars. That evening, he and his father sat on the back porch of their home. The media frenzy had finally died down, leaving a quiet, fragile peace in its wake. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the sound of the cicadas in the warm Georgia night. "I was so angry, Dad," David said finally, his voice quiet. "At the trial, in the cell, I was angry at you." Robert Anderson turned to look at his son. "Why at me?" "Because you weren't there," David said, the old hurt still present in his voice. "Because all those years, your job was this big, important, secret thing. It took you away from us, and I felt like you chose it over me." Robert looked out into the darkness. "I understand," he said softly. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the system that was supposed to protect you. I believed in the institution of justice, David. I believed that even with its flaws, it would eventually bend toward the truth." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I was so focused on the forest, I didn't see the rot in the trees. It took what they did to you for me to see it clearly." He turned back to David, his eyes filled with a profound and heavy sadness. "I wasn't there in that courtroom, and that is a failure I will carry with me for the rest of my life. But I promise you this, son. I will spend the rest of my career and the rest of my life making sure that what happened to you never happens to another child in this country again. Your case, it gave my work a new meaning. It gave it a face. It gave it a soul." David looked at his father. Not the Attorney General, not the powerful D.C. lawyer, but just his dad. He saw the weight of the world in his eyes, but he also saw an unwavering love. The anger he had held on to for so long finally began to dissolve. "I'm thinking about going into law," David said, a small smile touching his lips. Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Not a prosecutor," David clarified quickly, "or a judge. I want to be a public defender, a good one. I want to be the person who listens when no one else will." Robert Anderson looked at his son who had been to the darkest place and had come back not broken, but forged into something stronger. A deep sense of pride, so immense it almost hurt, swelled in his chest. "I have no doubt," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that you will be one of the great ones." In the quiet of the evening, under the vast, starry sky that David had always loved, a father and son began to heal. Two men bound forever by an injustice that had nearly destroyed them, but had instead given them both a new, unshakable purpose. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they were truly in it together. In the end, David Anderson's wrongful conviction sparked a fire that cleansed a corrupt corner of the justice system. Judge Vance was disgraced, the prosecutor disbarred, and the real killer brought to justice. The ordeal transformed David from a victim into a powerful advocate for change, inspiring David's law to protect other juveniles from similar fates. His father, the Attorney General, channeled his personal anguish into a renewed, nationwide fight for civil rights, proving that true power isn't just about upholding the law, but in correcting it when it fails. The system broke a boy, but in doing so, it created a man who would dedicate his life to fixing it. This story is a stark reminder of the battle between systemic injustice and individual truth. If it moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe for more content that matters, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation about justice in our communities.